All right, welcome back to Wisdom Teachings. I'm your host, David Wilcock, and in this episode, we are starting a new season and a new topic. There's going to be some bridge over from where we were before, but now I'm going to start to get into the mysterious phenomenon of interplanetary climate change. So we're starting to get into the actual change in the physics of our solar system corresponding to this new galactic energy zone that is coming in. The galactic energy zone is causing a change in physics. That's an important point. And there are also smaller energy zones that are not necessarily galactic that affect this cycle as well. It's going to be a little bit of a time before we get into that, but in order to properly understand what is happening to the sun, the planets, and the moons, in other words, they are becoming hotter, brighter, they're having more magnetic charge. In order to really understand this, we have to go beyond just the conventional physics models, and we have to understand how hyperdimensional realities intersect with our own. Multidimensionality is a strange thing. I've been studying it for many years. There are theories out there like superstring theory, which is the idea that the universe is ultimately made of vibrating strings, but that they're not really in our dimension, and only the jiggles of the string become visible to us. That is one theory. Sometimes they say there's 10 dimensions, sometimes they say there's 11. There's a brain theory, B-R-A-N-E, as in membranes. So there's a lot of competing modalities in the quantum world and in the greater relativistic type of physics as well about what are higher dimensions, how many are there, how do they work, all this kind of stuff. But what we don't get most of the time is an awareness of time itself not just being a one-dimensional vector. So before we get into the main subject of today, which is the geometric energy fields that I've been telling you so much about showing up in planets, which for me is one of the most exciting aspects of this. It's how I got started in all this the first time. It's important to understand what the heck could be behind this geometry showing up. Because the geometry is undeniable, and you're going to see that in this episode. But it's not just about, okay, well that's cool because there's a special upwelling or a special energy node on a planet at a certain geometric latitude. All by itself, that's just a curiosity. It doesn't really add up to anything. I'm always trying to connect dots for you. I'm always trying to bring the pieces together and get an overview, get a big picture perspective on what does this stuff really mean and where is it taking us. That way we're not stuck in a theoretical, abstract discussion, oh, it's too scientific, it's too scientific. No, the science gives credence to ancient prophecies, which we're briefly going to cover some of them again in this episode. But most importantly, we're dealing with a unified physics, a physics in which time and space are truly unified, which means that time also occupies 3 dimensions just like space. Now, I was explaining this in the previous episode. It can go very, very deep. We're not going to go deep on this one, but I am going to bring back Dr. William Tift, because this is the springboard that gets us into our new season, geometric energy fields and planets, scientific proof of ascension, all this really, really amazing stuff. It all comes off of this. So here we go. Let's dive back into this very briefly for your review in case you're popping into this season fresh and you haven't seen the previous ones. Dr. William Tift is expecting that our star, and in fact our planets, will go through a literal quantum shift, a change in the flow of time as these galactic zones that he discovered collide with us. And the way he did this, as I've been saying, is by investigating a phenomenon called redshift, which is basically microwave vibrations coming off of stars. Conventional astronomers say it's distance. He says no, it only shows up in certain quantities. Hence it's quantized. If you've been watching other episodes, you're like, yeah, okay, know all that, know all that. If not, go back and watch them. Now, he says that there are these actual zones that he can measure in galaxies, and this has to do with the light coming off of stars. What microwaves do they give off? And that light suddenly changes. It goes from one quantity to another with nothing in between. So there's no ramping up from one to the next. It's a sudden quantum shift. And how does he explain those quantum shifts that stars go through? He says time is 3-dimensional. That's his explanation. We've explored other explanations from Dr. Harold Aspden, but that's what he thinks is going on, and it's very, very relevant. I briefly quoted from this paper last time, three-dimensional quantized time in cosmology, meaning in galaxies. And the important points, again, was that a galaxy has a specific temporal space, meaning a specific flow of time. So he's literally saying that the whole way that you experience time would change. Now, that's a funny thing, because if you think about time, it appears that there's only an absolute reference point that we could have, which would be like the rotation of the Earth, and then the Earth revolving around the sun. That's how we measure time. 24 hours in a day. We take the length of time that the Earth spins and we chop it up into 24 pieces, and then we chop it on down from there. That's the only way that we really have, but so that, in other words, you could be on a planet, but that planet might be moving a lot faster through space, but you might experience a lot less time, such that, as I said, in books like the Bible, 1 year could be equivalent to 1,000 years. That appears to be how these higher dimensional beings function. So if you have a 25,000 year cycle, and this is very important because this whole season is launching us into that stuff big time. If you have a 25,000 year cycle, and like the ancient legends and the scientific evidence says, at the end of the cycle you get a big flood. You get a worldwide catastrophe. If that happens to us, and you experience 1 year as 1,000 years, that means every 25 years, if you try to live on the surface of the planet, you're going to have a flood. So clearly that's no good. This helps to explain why, if you watch Cosmic Disclosure, we're hearing that there are all these different civilizations of different people who came apparently from different origins, and if they want to be on Earth or anywhere in our solar system, it's very unlikely that they will live on the surface. It's far more likely that they will go inside the planet. And as we've seen from NASA now, there is liquid water inside the vast majority of the planets and moons in our solar system. Yes, the moons. So moons have liquid water inside, meaning if you have caverns in there and you can tap into that water like you're tapping into a well, or maybe it naturally uprises inside these caverns, then you could actually live in there and have a sustainable ecological civilization with nature and trees and plants and animals and all the things that we would expect, only inside. So NASA is just starting to give us the bits and pieces of this, including the fact that there could be 3 times as much water below the surface of the Earth as there is in the oceans. But it's all in these cracks that we're not seeing right now, but they're able to measure it by the sloshing movement of the Earth's gravity. So it's very important to see that if you have an acceleration of the flow of time, and if there is a 25,000 year cycle that's consistent across the whole galaxy for every solar system, a star seems to give off this big flash of light and energy in 25,000 year intervals. It's apparently, according to the law of one at least, it's a universal standard. They all do this. It's part of the design of life on Earth and throughout any biological civilization. You have these catastrophes, and it's karma. So if you're a positive person, you go through ascension. If you're a neutral person, you get transplanted to the next cycle where you're safe. And if you're a negative person, you actually experience that reality of a catastrophe. So like a story like Noah's flood is an example where the people who do not need the karma are transported away from that disaster before it takes place. And we've talked about the pre-Adamites and how those people with the elongated skulls who appear to be extraterrestrial immigrants, we've talked about this a lot on Cosmic Disclosure, they did go through the catastrophe because they were apparently very wicked, and we see legends of this happening to them in the Aztecs. We see it in the Vatican Library, the Library of Alexandria transferred over to the Vatican. All kinds of stuff like that suggests they did go through this. The Edgar Cayce readings talk about it, and many of the secret insider testimonies talk about it as well. It all comes back to tau space, that time changes, your whole solar system's rate of time fundamentally jumps up. And once you evolve into that type of a being, you could go into another solar system where everybody else's time rate is slower, but you're still going to be running on that higher frequency. Hence the Nordics that Corey and others like William Tompkins have talked about. They might live 2,000 years, they might even live 5,000 years. So A galaxy must exist at a particular rate and flow of time in these zones that expand away from the center as they travel, and it changes in sudden, discrete steps, as we were saying last time. Now, this is what I wanted to get to last time we didn't have time for. Discover magazine actually covered William Tift in 1993 in an article called Man Stops Universe Maybe. And so I want to show you this because this guy has some very groundbreaking stuff that basically proves some kind of mega change is happening to our solar system that will involve a total rewrite of time as we know it. That's what his theoretical model predicts. And he's getting Discover magazine publicity. He's a legitimate, reputable, journaled, published, accredited scientist. So let's read what Discover had to say. More recently, Tift has also claimed to have evidence, and I'm skipping a lot of stuff here obviously, from observing the same galaxies over a period of 10 years that their redshifts change over time. We may be seeing some form of galactic evolution taking place before our very eyes. So what they're referring to here is that Tift was able to watch these circular zones in galaxies expanding, and he could see them moving. He could look at individual stars in that galaxy and notice that their frequencies had changed. Their microwave frequencies they gave off jumps up in this quantized burst. So you're seeing it right here in Discover magazine, proving that in fact that was a major part of his model. Let's keep reading. I've showed you this a bunch of times, but since it's a new season, this again is just what one of his models of these zones look like. So now we know from Discover they are on the move. They're expanding as they move away from the center, and everywhere you look, this is what we see. So just to summarize before we go into the next thing, because I'm not going to spend much time on this, they are on the move. They're expanding as they move away from the center, and everywhere you look, this is what we see. So just to summarize before we go into the next thing, because I'm not going to spend much time on this, Tift found that these zones are gradually expanding away from the center of galaxy like ripples on a pond. They crash into a given star system in certain set intervals of time because they're evenly spaced and they move at a steady speed. That means it's going to hit in regular clock-like intervals. It's not going to be random. It's very precise. Okay? Each star's light that it gives off, the microwave frequency of light, undergoes a sudden, spontaneous quantum shift, and time as we know it is fundamentally altered. So I drew this, well, I didn't really draw it, but I composited this image from two other images, one from NASA and one of a spherical torus. And that to me is a very accurate rendition of what you should be thinking of as I'm talking about these zones moving away from the center of a galaxy. Now, the one thing that this is missing, of course, is the geometry. When you see those in this diagram, they're more like donuts. And I think really they should be more spherical, but this was the best I could find to make it look right. When you have spheres that are making these domain walls, just like we saw in Roshin and Godin's experiment, remember that? Where they had a free energy device and then they feel cold in the space around it, even up through the ceiling of steel and concrete, they feel these cold zones, totally inexplicable in conventional science. Those are the spherical walls that this emitter, which in this case would be the center of the galaxy, which is not a black hole but a big star, that emitter is giving that off. There's geometry inside the sphere because the geometry is a product of resonance. So we're seeing this science appear on the galactic level geometry. The prophecy that really ties all this together, the most significant one of all about this interplanetary climate change, which, as I put my tongue firmly in cheek, NASA's hottest secret. We did talk about this all the way back on episodes 9 and 10 of Wisdom Teaching. So if you've literally watched the entire series, and we're now on episode 245, then you've seen a little bit of this, but I only did it in half of one episode, half of 9 and half of 10. Now, I pointed out in that episode an interesting fact, which is that I put this little star off to the top right of this diagram, not knowing why it was there. I kind of saw it originally as the center of the galaxy. Now I know that it's actually something else, and we're going to get into that. To me, the most important prophecy that glues this all together was, as it turns out, so important that it was written into the dollar bill. People have no idea how significant Novus Ordo Seclorum really is. And we could geek out on this quite a bit, and I've done it already in other shows. We're just going to focus on the bottom part, Novus Ordo Seclorum. As I said in episodes, I guess it was 9 and 10, Charles A.L. Totten, Civil War hero. Here he is as an older man. In 1882, writes a letter to Congress. He was the first lieutenant in the 4th Artillery U.S. Army. I'm sorry, not to Congress, to the Secretary of the Treasury. On February 10th, 1882, where he says, Novus Ordo Seclorum is a quotation from the 4th Eclogue, and Virgil's the one who wrote the Eclogues. He's a Greek poet, or Roman poet, rather, Roman poet. And he borrowed it from the mystic Sibylline records. Now again, the Sibylline story is something I could geek out on for a very long time. I already did that in the earlier episodes, so we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, because I want to get to the point. On for a very long time. I already did that in the earlier episodes, so we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, because I want to get to the point. But Sibyl there were Sibyls, and the word Sibyl means wise woman, and they were all called oracles as well. You've probably heard of that. This particular Sibyl was in a town called Cumae, which was the far western border of the Roman territory, around Mount Vesuvius. So there were all these volcanic gases, and she lived in these volcanic tubes. And we now know that there is a psychedelic chemical that comes from volcanic gas called ethylene, and apparently you really, really trip out on ethylene. Now, I'm not saying to try it, okay? If you live in Hawaii or whatever, don't go walking into the volcano. But apparently it works. And then she also used this extract from bay laurel leaves, which, you know, you see those big bay leaves in soup or something. Apparently you concentrate that and you get something out of that. She synergized them together. She'd go into this crazy, funky state of consciousness, and she would write down prophecies on leaves, literal leaves off of trees, and then leave them at the front of the caves. And so what you're seeing here is a hypothetical illustration of her, because after becoming famous for making these very accurate prophecies, people would find the leaves at the front of the cave. If nobody found them, they'd just blow away. She created a series of books, 9 books altogether. And she tried to present them to the king of Rome at the time, but she wanted an exorbitant amount of money, 9 bags of gold. He said, no freaking way. She says, okay, fine, and she burned 3 of the 9 books right in front of him. She goes back again. He says, what's the price now? 9 bags of gold. Well, now you only have six books. Why do you still want 9 bags of gold? That's crazy. She burns 3 more. She goes back the 3rd time. Now the priests are begging him, please, 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 will you pay her? You know, her prophecies are incredible. Everybody's talking about it. We've got to have this. Because she said, her future history of Rome. So he actually paid for it. She walks off with 9 bags of gold. They needed to haul it out with donkeys. It was so heavy. And it turns out that it accurately predicts all kinds of things that happened in Roman history. This became so sensitive that the Romans considered it more valuable than an entire room filled with gold. They would have done anything to get those first 6 books back. And they put it in a temple, very heavily guarded, like their Area 51. They called it Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill in Rome. Because they knew that if their enemies got their hands on this book, that they could totally be defeated, because it predicted exactly what was going to happen in their future. And it was incredibly, incredibly accurate. But the most important thing is that the prophecies continued beyond where we are right now, and they predict extraterrestrials coming back to Earth. They predict a golden age, and they predict a spontaneous quantum metamorphosis of what it means to be human. Now remember, this is a government cover-up going all the way back to the era before Christ. This stuff happened over 500 years before Jesus showed up. They already had these prophecies. They believed in the Sibyl. They believed in this stuff, and then in the decline of the Roman Empire, Virgil was allowed to copy it over into his eclogues. And somehow the quote from Sibyl ends up on the dollar, because that's how valuable they saw it to be. Novus Ordo Seclorum is a shortening of a longer phrase, which is something like Magnus ad integro seclorum nascitur ordo. And what it says, we're going to read right now. Check this out. A mighty order of ages is born anew. That becomes New World Order, or Novus Ordo Seclorum. That's where they got it from. Both the prophetic, virgin, and Saturnian kingdoms now return. Those are extraterrestrials. So she's predicting ETs coming back. Keep reading. The boy will soon to be born, in whom the Iron Age shall come to an end, and the Golden One shall arise again in the whole earth, meaning children will be born. As these extraterrestrials come back to Earth, children will be born that create a new human race. This is totally related to the idea of the rate of time changing because the sun does some big flash. It's all part of it. It's all in here. And it's on the dollar. The world's elites take this very, very seriously. Let's keep reading. Whatso tracks remain of our old wickedness and evil, once done away with, meaning evil is gone, will free the earth from never-ceasing fear. That sounds pretty darn good. He, meaning this new boy that's born, which is all of us as we go through this change, we shall receive the life of gods and see heroes and gods commingling, and himself be seen of them, meaning he will be seen as a god. And with his Father's worth, reign over a world at peace. This is a very, very different prophecy than how this bastardized New World Order vision of population reduction, genocide, mind control, microchips, vaccines, all this crazy stuff they're doing, martial law, internment camps, phony wars, that is not at all what this prophecy is talking about. The prophecy is talking about the world being freed from fear and wickedness. A golden age in which extraterrestrials have returned. So these guys have their own fundamentalist religion, and I do see it as fundamentalist. I've talked about this quite a bit. But they're wrong about some very intrinsic details. And this prophecy, I believe that extraterrestrials worked through the Sibyl to give this dazzling prophecy so that it would be preserved for our time. It ended up on the dollar because they knew how serious that Sibyl stuff was. Those books were incredibly prophetic and accurately described all kinds of things that happened in Roman history, and it goes right straight through into things that we still today have not yet seen. The whole key to understanding why this change is going to transform what it means to be human all comes back to sacred geometry. And up until now, I very painstakingly built out the model on the largest cosmic level and at the tiniest quantum level. I've even taken it into galaxies and the shape of the galaxy and the shape of the arms being geometric. Finally, we're at the point where we get into the planets and the geometric energy fields. This, of course, came to my attention way back in 1993 with the classic 19.5 degrees. If you were back involved in the esoteric community in the late 1990s, then you know that Art Bell, Coast to Coast AM, was the only place, really, that you could hear any of this stuff with any consistency. It was by far the most popular. There was also, Jeff Rentz had his sightings show, Laura Lee had a show. That was about it. And Art Bell was totally syndicated across AM radio. Then he eventually handed over the torch to George Norrie, and George Norrie has the Beyond Belief show on this network. Back in the heyday of Coast, when it was at its peak, it was estimated sometimes that 20 million people would listen to an episode. And Richard C. Hoagland, anybody would argue, was the most popular and frequent guest on Coast. He and Art Bell would really get into it, and Richard was always talking about 19.5, 19.5. So what the heck is that? Now we're going to get into it. Here we go. This was the weird model. And the model is a geometric pattern inside a planet in which, for some mysterious reason, there are energetic effects that take place where the corners of the tetrahedron emerge. So if this is a little bit hard to see, notice that there is a yellow pyramid in the middle of this planet, and that yellow pyramid has a triangular base, and the tip of the pyramid is at the North Pole. So that's one solid pyramid, if you will, just drawn with lines. There's another pyramid where its tip is touching the South Pole, and that pyramid is inverted. It's in the upside down position from the one on top, and that's the red one. So in this case, the upside down pyramid, if you put it inside a sphere, it will touch the edges perfectly 1 at the pole, and then 3 at exactly 19.47 degrees above or below the equator. Now, the curious thing is that there are very real measurable phenomena that occur in stars, gas planets, and solid planets at the 19.5 degree latitude. Now, what's interesting is that very measurable phenomena take place where this tetrahedron is. On a solid planet, you have volcanoes. The crust literally bumps up, and you get these huge, huge volcanoes. And on gas planets or in stars, you get swirling atmospheric vortexes. So in both cases, I ultimately realized it has to do with the swirling of the material inside the planet. The volcano is the result of swirling magma, and the atmospheric vortex is the result of swirling atmosphere. There's also vortexes that appear in oceans as well. Vortex is the result of swirling atmosphere. There's also vortexes that appear in oceans as well for planets that would have liquid water. So people got really confused about this for a long time. They said, oh, Richard Hoagland is crazy. He says there's crystals inside planets. No, it's not a crystal. It's an energetic force. And much more recently, after I first read about this, we discovered that it still shows up in the quantum level as well. Take a look at this. This is an sp3 shape of electrons. So that's called an electron orbital. Look at this. You go down to the quantum level, this is called an sp3. Right there in the middle is the nucleus. And then you see that these electron clouds, because remember, there really is no electron, it's just a field of probability. It shows up in a perfect tetrahedral shape. So this is very interesting because what it's doing is it's linking together quantum phenomena, and there's many others like this, and I've talked about them extensively on our show. The whole nature of the nucleus of the atom is all geometry, but it also shows up in the electrons, as I'm showing you right here in sp3. This is showing you a unified science, a science that starts from the smallest level and goes to the biggest level of a planet and even, again, the whole universe. Because that shape that we're looking at right now is also the original photon that fractalized into the universe, which we've talked about quite extensively. Now, it's very important to make sure that the record is set straight here, and Richard himself talked about this. He did not invent this on his own. He got this science from a very brilliant scientist named Dr. Tom Bearden. Tom Bearden wrote all kinds of fascinating books. Excalibur Briefing was one of them. He clearly worked on the inside with highly classified government top secret clearance, and he worked in a very interesting area of physics known as scalar. Now, Nikolai Kozyrev, the Russian physicist, he got way into this. He called it torsion fields. I call it the source field. Scalar, torsion, source field, it's all basically the same stuff. And I'm not going to get all into a big scalar discussion right now because we've done a lot on torsion. But here's Tom Bearden. And as you can see, he's a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army, military research and development areas. He is a new energy inventor, and he came out with all kinds of interesting stuff. One of the things that Hoagland has always been really good at, this goes all the way back to when he was still a teenager, and he managed a planetarium. And he was able to get people together and get a major media event to take place at his planetarium that was on television. He's a great team builder. He finds people who know what they're doing. He brings their knowledge together, synergizes it for the greater good, and I've been doing that too. So Bearden's knowledge about this 19.5 was interesting because it's a physics that corresponds to the layout of the Mars monuments. And so the Mars monuments, we're going to get into that in later episodes. We're not going to do all that right now. I want to just get into the geometry. One of the things about Hoagland's book that totally blew me away, because Monuments of Mars I read in 1993, was how he linked this weird science to crop circle formations, which clearly appeared to be from extraterrestrials. The crop circle formation that Richard got us all so excited about showed up on July 17th, 1991 in southern England in an area called Barbary Castle. And this is actually in a wheat field. It only comes up to your knees. And yet look at the staggering beauty and complexity of this diagram. Here's another view of it taken from a more overhead shot where you can clearly see, yes, there is a tetrahedron in there. The tetrahedron looks like a pyramid with a triangular base. And then you see there's 3 rings inside that tetrahedron. In Hoagland's book, he had this wireframe diagram, or one very similar to it, and he shows that there are angular relationships between those rings and the tetrahedron that perfectly describe the angles at which a tetrahedron touches a sphere. So whoever did this, and again, these things show up out of nowhere. They are not done by Doug and Dave, 2 drunk guys staggering around the field after a few pints of beer and, hey, let's make a crop circle. No, this is actual extraterrestrial phenomena. It goes back, as I've said in previous episodes, to the Archbishop of Lyon in like early 700s AD era, forbidding people from taking crops out of crop circles because they were so widely being stolen that the farmers were getting angry. This has been going on for a long time. And we could do a whole lot on crop circles, and we will in the future. Right for now, suffice it to say, I believed when I was reading this book, as do many others, that these were made by extraterrestrials, not people on Earth. And when you look at this, there's some interesting stuff. Because if you look at the circle on the bottom left, that would be like a point in a void, like the beginning of the universe. Then you look at the circle on the top, and it starts to flow like a pinwheel. That point starts to spread out in 2 dimensions, like it's the 2nd dimension. Then you look at the circle on the right, and it actually traces out over a Pyramid of Giza type of shape. If you look at those straight lines in there, and then you see what's going on, it's as if there is a spiral tracing along the surface of a pyramid. Now, Hoagland was really big on the tetrahedron. It was all about 19.5. It was all about tetrahedral geometry. But after his book came out, other crop circles showed up that very clearly showed us additional geometry. This was one of the most stunning ones of all. Take a look. This formation, this was one of the most stunning ones of all. Take a look. This formation showed up well after Hoagland's book was written. It totally blew me away. I remember when it came out. It shows very clearly a sphere with a cube inside of it, and then another sphere inside the cube. Unbelievable. So the same people who are telling us, look at tetrahedral geometry, are telling us, look at the geometry of the cube as well. And there are many, many crop circles that illustrate this for us. So in the next episode, we're going to take this much farther. I'm going to show you a few more crop circles building off of this sacred geometry pattern, and then we're going to see how this 19.5 degree phenomena actually appears in the behavior of the sun, solid planets, and gas planets. And it is mind-blowing. And that's our springboard that leverages us directly into a discussion about interplanetary climate change, because this geometry is not in our 3D world. It's some hyperdimensional force that pushes on 3D matter, like atmospheres or the lava underneath the crust of a planet. But it itself does not exist in our 3D world. So if we can prove that this geometry is affecting our solar system quite dramatically, then we can also suggest that there is a hyperdimensional effect happening to us on Earth that is going to springboard us into this new rate of time that Dr. William Tift was talking about, and the new plane of etheric existence that Dr. Harold Afton was talking about in the last season. All of that and much more is coming up in the next episode of Wisdom Teachings. Don't miss it. I'm your host, David Wilcock, and I thank you for watching.